Hey y'all, and welcome to our second podcast on public opinion and political action. Today we will be looking at measuring public opinion and political information, as well as what Americans values, political ideology. Our learning objectives for today are 1. Explain how polls are conducted and what can be learned from them about American public opinion. Second, assess the influence of political ideology on Americans' political thinking and behavior. Okay, let's begin with measuring public opinion and political information. It is very essential to explain how polls are conducted and what can be learned from them about American public opinion. Public opinion is the distribution of people's beliefs about politics and policy issues. There is rarely a single public opinion. With so many people and such diversity of populations, there are also many opinions. Public opinion is one of the products of political learning. Think about public opinion this way: what Americans believe and believe they know is public opinion. The distribution of people's beliefs about politics and policy issues. How polls are conducted. Public opinion polling was first developed by George Gallup in 1932. Polls rely on a sample of the population, a relatively small portion of people who are chosen as representative of the whole. The whole purpose is to measure public opinion. The key to the accuracy of opinion polls is random sampling, which operates on the principle that everyone should have an equal probability of being selected. However, there is always a certain amount of risk of inaccuracy involved, known as sampling error. Sophisticated technology is now available for measuring public opinion. Most polling is now done on the telephone, with samples selected through random digit dialing, in which calls are placed to telephone numbers within randomly chosen exchanges. In this era of cell phones, many pollsters are starting to worry whether this methodology will continue to work much longer. The role of polls in American democracy. Supporters of polling believe it is a tool for democracy, by which policymakers can keep in touch with changing opinions on issues. Critics of polling think it makes politicians more concerned with following than leading, and may thus discourage bold leadership. Recent research by Jacobs and Shapiro argues that the common perception of politicians pandering to the results of public opinion polls may be mistaken. Rather than using polls to identify centrist approaches that will have the broadest appeal, Jacobs and Shapiro argue that elites use them to formulate strategies that enable them to avoid compromising on what they want to do. Polls can weaken democracy by distorting the election process. Polls are often accused of creating a bandwagon effect, in which voters may support a candidate only because they see that others are doing so. Emphasis on polls results sometimes drowned out the issues of recent presidential campaigns. The election day exit poll is probably the most criticized type of poll. Perhaps the most pervasive criticism of polling is that pollsters can get pretty much the results they want by altering the wording of questions. Although the bias in such questions may be easy to detect, the ethical problem is that an organization may not report how the survey questions were worded. What polls reveal about Americans' political information? Polls reveal that the average American has a lower level of political knowledge than citizens of other countries at similar levels of development. Part of the reason the American political system works as well as it does is that people do know the basic values they want upheld, even when they do not have information on policy questions or decision makers. Increased levels of education and the increased availability of information over the last 4 decades have scarcely raised public knowledge about politics. Public cynicism and mistrust of government undermines the ability of government to address pressing social problems. The decline of trust in government. In the late 1950s and early 60s, nearly 3/4 of Americans said that they trusted the government in Washington to do the right thing, always or mostly. By the late 60s, however, researchers started to see a deep drop in public trust in government. First Vietnam and then Watergate shook the people's confidence in the federal government. The economic troubles of the Carter years and the Iran hostage crisis helped continue the slide. By 1980, only 1/4 of the public thought the government could be trusted, most of the time or always. Since then, trust in the government has occasionally risen for a while, but the only time a majority said they could trust the government most of the time was in 2002, after the events of September 11th. Now let's turn and look at what Americans value: political ideology. A political ideology is a coherent set of values and beliefs about public policy. Who are the liberals and the conservatives? I know you are so glad that I asked that question. Well, let me tell you. Generally, Americans tend to identify themselves as conservatives more than moderates or liberals, which help to account for relatively limited scope of government in the United States. But who identifies as a liberal or a conservative often varies according to age, gender, race, and socioeconomic status. Groups with political clout tend to be more conservative than groups whose members have often been shut out from the halls of political power. Women are not a minority group, making up about 54% of the population, but they have nevertheless been politically and economically disadvantaged. Compared to men, women are more likely to support spending on social services and to oppose the higher levels of military spending, which conservatives typically advocate. This ideology difference between men and women have led to the gender gap, which refers to the regular pattern by which women are more likely to support Democratic candidates. Another good question: do people think in ideological terms? Ideological thinking is not widespread in the American public, nor are people necessarily consistent in their attitudes. For most people, the terms liberal and conservative are not as important as they are for political elites. Thus, the authors of the classic study, The American Voter, Agnes Campbell and all, concluded that to speak of election results as indicating a movement of the public to either the left or the right is a misnomer, because most voters do not think in such terms. The authors of the classic study, The American Voter, divided the public into 4 groups according to ideological sophistication. Ideologues, only 20% could connect their opinions and beliefs with broad policy positions taken by parties or candidates. Group benefits voters, 42% of Americans thought of politics mainly by the groups they liked or disliked. Nature of the times voters, the handle on politics of 24% of the population was limited to whether the time seemed good or bad to them. No issue content voters, 22% of the voters were devoid of any ideological or issue content in their political evaluations. Most simply voted routinely for a party or judged the candidates by their personalities. If the same methods are used to update the analysis of the American voter through the 1980s, one finds some increase in the proportion of ideologues, but the overall picture looks much the same. For most people, the terms liberal and conservative are just not as important as they are for the political elite, such as politicians, activists, journalists, and the like. Although some point to gay rights as an example of an issue that polarizes the country into a culture war, polling data indicates a gradually increasing acceptance of gays and lesbians among liberals, moderates, and conservatives alike. That concludes our second podcast on public opinion and political action. In this podcast, we looked at measuring public opinion and political information, as well as what Americans value, political ideologies. Our learning objectives were: 1. Explain how polls are conducted and what can be learned from them about American public opinion. 2. Assess the influence of political ideology on Americans' political thinking and behavior. Thank you for tuning in, and join us for our next podcast and last podcast on political opinion and public action. In that podcast, we will focus on how Americans participate in politics and understanding political opinion and political action.